Nouns in Latin were grouped into three grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. But in late antiquity, even as early as the 1st century AD, Latin's neuter gender was already in the process of disappearing. Neuter words like tempus, mare, and aurum were already being reassigned by late Latin speakers as either masculine or feminine. So because of that, you might think that the Romance languages eventually lost the neuter gender altogether. But that doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, to varying degrees, the Romance languages today still preserve small but revealing vestiges of that old Latin third gender. Today we'll look at some of those remnants in languages like Neapolitan, Romanian, and Asturian, and see how in some unexpected ways the Latin neuter gender still lives on. Welcome to Jack of All Languages, the show where we travel through time and across cultures one language at a time. Today we pick up where we left off last week, with a deeper dive into the legacy of the Latin neuter gender in the Romance languages. And if you didn't see last week's video, I'll add a link here. Last week we talked about a group of words that used to be neuter in Latin, but ended up both masculine and feminine in Italian, depending on whether they were singular or plural. Today we zoom out and look at a broader group of Romance languages, and what they did with this grammatical category. So let's get started. To start, we need to look at the ancestor of all of these Romance languages, which of course is Latin. Latin, as we said, had three grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and it's important to note that Latin had three different inflectional categories, or three different sets of endings for nouns, pronouns, and adjectives for each of these grammatical genders. So let's look at a couple of examples. Canis parvus means the small dog in Latin, and it's an example of our masculine agreement pattern with that ending us at the end of the adjective. Casa parva means the small hut or the small house, and it's an example of our feminine agreement pattern with that a ending at the end of the adjective. And brachium parvum, meaning the small arm, is an example of our neuter agreement pattern. So this is something that we need to take note of, because with one possible exception, the Romance languages do not have these three different groups of endings for nouns and adjectives anymore. They only have two. So what happens to these neuter words in Latin? Even while Latin is still being spoken in the Roman Empire, the Latin neuter gender is starting to fade. It's starting to disappear. We have evidence that as early as the 1st century AD, speakers are starting to reassign neuter words as either masculine or feminine. And most neuter nouns are going to end up being reassigned as masculine, although a small group of them, especially those that have a collective meaning, are going to end up being feminine in the Romance languages. So let's go ahead and turn to our first Romance language that we'll look at today, and that is Romanian. Romanian has traditionally been said to have three genders, just like Latin. But today, many scholars dispute whether this neuter gender in Romanian is actually a true neuter. So let's look at some examples and see what this Romanian neuter is all about. So take a look at this chart here. What we have are three different words, one masculine, one feminine, and one neuter, in the singular and the plural, paired with the adjective meaning tall, înalt. And what you'll notice is that just like in the other Romance languages, the adjective gets a different ending depending whether it's masculine or feminine, singular or plural. Bărbatul înalt is the tall man, but bărbații înalți is the tall men. Fata înaltă, the tall girl. Fetele înalte, the tall girls. But when we get to the neuter, we don't actually have a different set of endings here. Instead, what we have is the masculine ending for the singular neuter, hotelul înalt, the tall hotel. And then in the plural neuter, we just use the feminine plural ending for the adjective, hotelurile înalte. Do these neuter nouns actually represent a third gender in Romanian? Or is this just a case where some nouns are masculine when they're singular and feminine when they're plural? Well, it depends on how we look at them. Whether we analyze these nouns from a historical, diachronic point of view, looking at their ancestry or where they came from, or whether we look at them from a more modern, synchronic point of view, looking at how these words are actually used today, what their function is in today's language. Most of these neuter words actually come from the neuter gender in Latin. So if you look at them from this historical perspective, you can make the argument that this is a continuation of the Latin neuter gender, and it's found kind of a new purpose in the Romanian language. But many linguists analyze these words today from a more synchronic or modern usage point of view, and they argue that these words do not represent a third gender class in Romanian. Why? Well, there are no separate adjective endings for the neuter gender in Romanian. Remember how in Latin we had those three different sets of endings for masculine, feminine, and neuter? Romanian does not have that. Instead, what's happening is that these nouns are getting analyzed as masculine when they're singular and feminine when they're plural. And so, even though these nouns come from what used to be the neuter gender in Latin, most scholars view them today as a separate thing that evolved out of that neuter gender, but today is not functioning in the same way. So what we really have is a group of nouns that have split agreement. But nonetheless, it's super interesting because these nouns undoubtedly come from what was the neuter gender in Latin, and so in a small way they still carry on its legacy. So now let's leave behind Eastern Europe and travel west to Italy and Spain. And we're going to look at two different minority languages that carry on the Latin neuter gender in a different way from what we saw in Romanian. And the first of these languages is Neapolitan. Neapolitan is spoken by about 7 million people in and around the city of Napoli in Italy. And it's important to note that it is not a dialect of Italian, but rather it's a separate language that evolved alongside Italian out of Latin. Something very interesting about the Neapolitan language is that it has a third gender class, what's traditionally been called the neuter. But is this really a true neuter? Let's look at some examples and see for ourselves. Masculine nouns in Neapolitan get paired with the definite article o. So o sole, for example, is the sun. Feminine articles get paired with the definite article a. So for example, a guaiona is the girl. And then there's a third gender class which traditionally has been called the neuter. And this neuter class also uses the definite article o. But the neuter triggers a really interesting linguistic phenomenon called ridoppiamento sintattico, which really just means that after this neuter definite article o, the first consonant of the next word gets doubled. So for example, o fiero, o pane. So why does this happen? The masculine definite article o descends from a Latin demonstrative pronoun illum, meaning that. So in the progression from Latin to Neapolitan, we might have had something like this. Illum filium, lo fidio, and then o fidio. But the neuter definite article o, in spite of being the same word today, comes from a different form of the Latin demonstrative pronoun, illud. So what seems to have happened here is that instead of getting dropped like the M does in that masculine version of the word, that final duh sound instead gets assimilated to the initial consonant of the next word. So in the progression from Latin to Neapolitan, in the case of the neuter gender, we may have had something like this. Illud ferrum, lud ferro, lu fiero, o fiero. And I want to emphasize that these forms are not attested. This is just a possible reconstruction of how we could have gotten from this sound to that sound. So let's return to the central question of this episode. Does this really represent a productive neuter gender in Neapolitan? Well, the problem is that a lot of these words actually don't come from neuter nouns in Latin, but instead were reanalyzed into this group later by Neapolitan speakers. Take the example of pane. Pane in Neapolitan comes from panem in Latin, which was actually a masculine noun. So really what we have here is not a group of neuter nouns, but instead a group of uncountable or collective mass nouns. And this category is used for things that are uncountable, like iron or bread, or conceptual things like the Neapolitan language itself, o Napolitano. And a lot of these words actually have both a masculine and a neuter version. And the masculine version would refer to a countable substance, like a loaf of bread or a slice of bread, while the uncountable version would refer to the substance, like the substance of bread. The masculine versions would not get this ridoppiamento sintattico. So you have o pane and o pane, o vino and ovino, o latte and o latte. So to summarize briefly, in Neapolitan, the neuter isn't really something that a noun is. Instead, it's something that a noun does, like when it's used as a mass or an abstract concept. And so now we'll move even farther to the west, to the region of Asturias in Spain. Asturian is a language spoken by about 100,000 native speakers and as many as 450,000 second language speakers according to some estimates. And again, it's worth emphasizing that this is not a dialect of Spanish, but it's actually its own language that evolved alongside Spanish. Asturian belongs to the Astur-Leonese family, and this is the only Western Romance language family that's traditionally been said to have 3 different grammatical genders. So let's go ahead and look at some examples from Asturian to see how this language handles masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns and adjectives. Here's some examples of some masculine nouns. El tiempo, l'home, el pantalón. And when you want to use an adjective to describe one of these nouns, it'll get the ending u. For example, el vaso tá frio. Here are some examples of some feminine nouns in Asturian. La casa, la gente, la noche. And if you want to pair an adjective with one of these nouns, it'll get the ending a. For example, tengo la mano fría. And then there's a third class, and this is where things get super interesting. The Asturian neuter nouns can be paired with either the masculine or the feminine definite article. So you can have el fierro and la leche, which are both neuter. But when you pair these nouns with an adjective, that adjective will get a separate neuter ending, o. For example, el fierro viejo, la leche frío. And to put it into a complete phrase, we could say, el agua tá frío. This is super fascinating because here we might have the best case for an actual neuter gender in a Romance language. Because, like Latin, Asturian actually has 3 different inflectional classes for adjectives. So what do the scholars say about this? Is this actually neuter or is this something else? Well, like in Neapolitan, this class of nouns in Asturian refers more to a category of uncountable mass nouns than to an original neuter class of nouns from Latin. For example, agua comes from a Latin noun that was feminine, while el café, which is neuter in Asturian, doesn't even come from Latin at all. So again, analyzing this from a synchronic perspective, from how these words are actually used today, you can make the argument that this isn't actually a neuter gender, this is more of a collective class of nouns. But unlike Neapolitan, as we said, Asturian actually has that third class of endings for adjectives. And this strengthens the argument for calling this group of nouns in Asturian a true neuter. So, is the Latin neuter still alive in the Romance languages? Well, it depends on what you mean by that question. Yes, there are traces of it. There are even productive categories of words and morphology that derive from it. But if you want to argue that a third gender category, like the one in Latin, still exists in Romanian, in Asturian, and Neapolitan, that's going to be tougher to prove. But yes, there are plenty of vestiges of the neuter, like the word vestige itself, in fact, which comes from the Latin neuter noun vestigium and ended up in Italian as masculine in the singular, il vestigio, and feminine in the plural, le vestigia, just like those Romanian neuter nouns that we saw at the beginning of today's episode. On that poetic note of vestiges, I'll close today's discussion. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider liking and subscribing and commenting, and let me know if you want to hear more details about the Latin neuter gender or other related topics, or if you want to hear about totally different topics. Please leave me a comment, I would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching, see you next time.